readers, welcome back to Reads with Room B with me, Room B, and today we will be continuing on with our story Peter Pan. And today we will be doing chapter 13, Do You Believe in Fairies? The more quickly this horror is disposed of, the better. The first to emerge from his tree was Curly. He rose out of it into the arms of Sisu, who flung him to Smee, who flung him to Starkey, who flung him to Bill Jukes, who flung him to Noodler, and so he was tossed from one to another till he fell at the feet of the Black Pirate. All the boys were plucked from their trees in this ruthless manner, and several of them were in the air at the time, like bales of hay, and flung like bales of goods flung from hand to hand. Different treatment was accorded to Wendy, who came out last. With ironical politeness, Hook raised his hat to her, and offering her his arm, he escorted her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it with such an air that he was so frightfully distinguished that she was too fascinated to cry out, for she was only a little girl. And perhaps it is telltale to divulge that for the moment Hook entranced her, and we tell on her only because her slip led to strange results. Had she haughtily unhanded him, and we should have loved to have righted of her, she would have been hurled through the air like the others, and then Hook probably would not have been present at the tying of the children. And had he not been present at the tying of the children, he would have discovered Slightly's secret, and without the secret he could not presently have made of his foul attempt on Peter's life. They were tied to prevent their flying away, doubled up with their knees so close to their ears, and for the trussing of them, the Black Pirate had cut the rope into 9 equal pieces. All went well until Slightly's turn came, and when he was found to be like those irritating parcels that used up all the string in going round and leaving no tags for which to tie a knot to. The pirates kicked him in their rage, just as you kick the parcel, though in fairness you should kick the string. And strange to say, it was Hook who told them to allay their violence. His lips curled with malicious triumph, while his dogs were merely sweating because every time they tried to pack the unhappy lad tight into one part, he bulged out in another. Hook's mastermind had gone far beneath Slightly's surface, probing not for effects but for causes, and his exultation showed that he had found them. Slightly white to the gills, knew that Hook had surprised his secret, which was this. So that no boy blown out could use a tree wherein an average man needed a stick. Poor Slightly, most wretched of all children now, for he was in a panic about Pan, bitterly regretted what he had done. Madly addicted to drinking of water when he was hot, he had swelled into consequence to his present girth, and instead of reducing himself to fit his tree, he had, unknowns to others, witted his tree to make it fit him. Sufficient of this, Hook guessed to persuade him that Peter at last lay at his mercy, but no word of the dark design that now formed on the subterranean caverns of his mind crossed his lips. He merely signed that the captives were to be conveyed to the ship, and he would be alone. How to convey them? Hunched up in their ropes, They might indeed be rolled down the hill like barrels, but most of the way lay through a morass. Again, Hook's genius surmounted the difficulties. He indicated that the little houses must be used as conveyance. The children were flung about. The children were flung into it, and forced out pirates raised it onto their shoulders, and others fell in behind, singing the hateful pirate chorus that could be the strange procession set off throughout the wood. I don't know whether any of the children were crying. If so, the singing drowned out the sound. But as the little house disappeared into the forest, a brave though tiny jet of smoke issued from its chimney as if defying Hook. Hook saw it, and did Peter a bad service. It dried up any trickle of pity for him that may have remained in the pirate's infuriated breast. The first thing he did on finding himself alone in the fast-falling night was to tiptoe to Slightly's tree and make sure that it would provide him with a passage. Then for long he remained brooding, his hat of ill omen on the swarth, so that any gentle breeze which might have arisen might play refreshingly through his dark hair. Dark as his thoughts were, his blue eyes were as soft as periwinkle. Intently he listened for any sound from the netherworld. But all was silent below as above. The house under the ground seemed to be but one more empty tenement in the void. Was that boy asleep, or did he stand waiting at the foot of Slightly's tree with his dagger in hand? There was no way of knowing, save by going down. Hook let his cloak slip softly to the ground, and then biting his lip till a lewd blood stood upon them, he stepped into the tree. He was a brave man, but for a moment he had to stop there and wipe his brow, which was dripping like a candle. And then he silently let himself go into the unknown. He arrived unmolested at the foot of the shaft, and stood still again, biting his breath, which almost left him. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, various objects in the home under the trees took shape, but only one on which his greedy gaze rested, long sought for and found at last, was the great bed. On the bed lay Peter, fast asleep. Unaware of the tragedy being enacted above, Peter had continued, for some little time after the children left, to play gaily on his pipes, no doubt rather a forlorn attempt to prove to himself that he did not care. Then he decided not to take his medicine so as to grieve Wendy, and then he lay down on the bed outside the coverlet to vex her still more, for she always tucked them inside it. Because you never know that you may not grow chilly at the turn of the night. Then he nearly cried, but it struck him how indignant he would be if he laughed instead. So he laughed a hearty laugh and fell asleep soundly in the middle of it. Sometimes, though not often, he had dreams, for they were more painful than the dreams of other boys. For hours he could not be separated from these dreams, though he wailed piteously in them. They had to do, I think, with the riddle of his existence. At such times it had been Wendy's custom to take him out of his bed and sit with him on her lap, soothing him in the dear ways of her own invention, and when he grew calmer she put him back in bed before he quite woke up, so that he would not know of the indignity to which she had subjected him. But on this occasion he had fallen into a dreamless sleep. One arm dropped over the edge of the bed, one leg arched, and the unfinished part of his laugh was stranded in his mouth, which was open, showing little pearly whites. Thus defenseless, Hook found him. He stood silent at the foot of the tree, looking across the chamber at his enemy. Did no feeling of compassion disturb his somber breast? This man was not wholly evil. He loved flowers, I have been told, and sweet music. He himself was no mean performer on the harpsichord. And let it be frankly admitted, the idyllic nature of the scene stirred him profoundly. Mastered by his better self, he would have returned reluctantly up the tree, but for one thing. What stayed him was Peter's impertinent appearance as he slept. The open mouth, the drooping arm, the arched knee, they were the personification of cockiness, as taken together will never again, one may hope, be present to eyes so sensitive to their offensiveness. They steeled Hook's heart. His rage had broken him into hundreds of pieces. Every one of them would have disregarded the incident and leapt at the sleeper. Though a light from one of the lamps shone dimly on the bed, Hook stood in darkness himself, and at first stealthily stepped forward. He discovered an obstacle, the door of Slightly's tree. It did not entirely fill the aperture, and had he been looking over it, feeling for the catch, he found to his fury that it was low down beyond his reach. To his disordered brain it seemed then that this irritating quality of Peter's face and figure invisibly increased as he rattled the door and flung himself against it. Was his enemy to escape him after all? But what was that? The red in his eye caught sight of Peter's medicine standing on the ledge within easy reach. He fathomed what it was straight away, and immediately he knew the sleeper was in his power. Lest he should be taken alive, Hook always carried about his person a dreadful drug, blended up by himself of all the death-dealing rings that had come into his possession. These he had boiled down into a yellow liquid quite unknown to science, which was probably the most virulent poison in existence. 5 drops he now added to Peter's cup. His hand shook, but it was in exultation rather than shame, as he did it to avoid glancing on the sleeper, but not lest pity should unnerve him, merely to avoid spilling. Then one long, gloating look he cast upon his victim, and turning, wormed his way with difficulty up the tree. As he emerged at the top, he looked at the very spirit of an evil breaking from. As he emerged from the top, he looked at the very spirit of evil breaking from its hole. Donning his hat at its most rakish angle, he wound his cloak around him, holding one end in front of him as if to conceal his person from the night, of which it was the blackest part, and muttering strangely to himself, he stole away through the trees. Peter slept on. The light guttered and went on, leaving the tenant in darkness, but still he slept. It must have been not less than 10 o'clock by the crocodile, when he suddenly sat up in his bed, awakened by he knew not what. It was a soft, cautious tapping at the door of his tree, soft and cautious, but in this stillness it was sinister. Peter felt for his dagger till he gripped it, and then he spoke. "Who is that?" For long there was no answer, and then the knock again. "Who are you?" No answer. He was thrilled. He loved being thrilled. In 2 strides he reached the door. Unlike Slightly's door, it filled the aperture, so he could not see beyond it, nor could the one knocking see him. "I won't open unless you speak," cried Peter, and then at last the visitor spoke in a lovely bell-like voice. "Let me in, Peter." It was Tink. He quickly unbarred to her, and she flew in excitedly, her face flushed and her dress stained with mud. "What is it? Oh, you could never guess," she cried, and offered him 3 guesses. "Out with it," he shouted, in one ungrammatically correct sentence. as long as the ribbon conjurers pull from their mouths, and she told of the capture of Wendy and the boys. Peter's heart bobbed up and down as he listened. Wendy bound on a pirate ship, she who loved everything to be just so. I'll rescue her, he cried, leaping for his weapons. As he leapt, he thought of something pleasing he could do. He took his medicine. His hand closed on the fatal draught. No, shrieked Tinker Bell, who had heard Hook mutter about his deed as he sped through the forest. Why not? It is poisoned. Poisoned? Who could have poisoned it? Hook. Don't be silly. How could Hook have gotten down here? Alas, Tinker Bell could not explain this, for even she did not know the dark secret of Slightly's tree. Nevertheless, Hook's words left no room for doubt. The cup was poisoned. Besides, said Peter, quite believing himself, I never fell asleep. He raised the cup. No time for words now. No time for deeds. No time for words now. Time for deeds. And with one of her lightning movements, Tink got between his lips and the draught and drained it to the dregs. Why, Tink, how dare you drink my medicine? But she did not answer. She was already reeling in the air. What's the matter with you? Cried Peter, suddenly afraid. It was poison, Peter, she told him softly, and now I'm going to be dead. Oh, Tink, did you drink it to save me? Yes. But why, Tink, why? Her wings would scarcely carry her now, but in reply she alighted on his shoulder and gave his nose a loving bite, and whispered in his ear, You silly ass, and then tottering to her chamber, she lay down on her bed. His head was filled with the fourth wall of her little room. As he knelt near her in distress, every moment her light was growing fainter, and he knew that if it went out, she would be no more. She liked his tears so much that she put her beautiful finger up to let them run over them. Her voice was so low that at first he could not make out what she said, and then he made it out. She was saying that she thought she could be well again if children believed in fairies. I need a drink, dear readers. Peter flung his arms out. There were no children there, and it was night time. But he addressed all who might be dreaming of Neverland, and who were, therefore, nearer to him than you think. The boys and girls in their nighties, and their naked papooses in their baskets hung from trees. Do you believe? He cried. Tink sat up in bed almost briskly to listen to her fate. She fancied she heard answers in the affirmative, and then again she wasn't sure. What do you think? She asked Peter. If you believe, he shouted out to them, clap your hands. Oh, clap. Oh, please do. Don't let Tink die. And many clapped. Some didn't. A few beasts hissed. The clapping stopped suddenly, as if countless mothers had rushed to their nurseries to see what on earth was happening. But Tink was saved. First her voice grew strong, and then she popped out of bed and was flashing through the room, more merry and impudent than ever. She never thought of thanking those who believed, but she would have liked to get those ones who'd hissed. And now to rescue Wendy. The moon was riding in a cloudy heaven when Peter rose from his tree. Begirt with weapons and wearing little else, he set out upon his perilous quest. It was not such a night as he would have chosen. He had hoped to fly, keeping not far from the ground, so as that nothing unwanted should escape his eye. But in that fitful light, to have flown low would have meant trailing his shadow through the trees, thus disturbing the birds and acquainting the watchful foe that he was astir. He regretted that he had given the birds of the island such strange names and that they were very wild and difficult to approach. There was no other course but to press forward in redskin fashion, at which happily he was adept. But in what direction? For he could not be sure that the children had been taken to the ship. A light fall of snow had obliterated all footmarks. A deathly silence pervaded the island, as if, for a space, nature stood still in horror of recent carnage. He had taught the children something of the forest lore that he had learned himself from Tiger Lily and Tinker Bell, and knew that in their dire hour they were not likely to forget it. Slightly, if he had an opportunity, would blaze the trees, for instance. Curly would drop seeds. Wendy would leave her handkerchief at some important place. The morning was needed to search for guidance, and he could not wait. The upper world called to him, but would give no help. The crocodile passed him, but not another living thing, not a sound, not one movement, and yet he knew well that sudden death might be at the next tree, stalking him from behind, and he swore his terrible oath. Hook or me this time. And now he crawled forward like a snake. Again and again, erect, he darted across a space on which moonlight played, one finger on his lip, and his dagger at the ready. He was frightfully happy. And that is our chapter for today. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time, readers. Stay awesome, safe, and keep reading. Bye for now.